Welcome to Learn Python for Economic Computation. Today we're going to be working with numbers. So we create a file named Working with Numbers, and we're going to go through some of the examples in the Working with Numbers section. The basic things that you need to know in this section are what type of numbers or what type of values are available in Python. The way to think about this is that anytime you enter a value, you save a value. The program needs to know exactly what is included in that value. Right, this is really easy for integers because it just saves a whole number. Whatever number you enter, it saves. But what about with decimals, with fractions, or with decimals? So the way to think about this is if I said 1.1, well, Python needs a container that can allow to save this decimal to some number of places. Okay, and so the container needs to be a set size so that every number can be defined. And that container is going to have typically a lot more space than is needed if you're just saving 1.1. Okay, so you could think of the computer as saving something like this, maybe not exactly, but 1.1 followed by a bunch of zeros, maybe even followed by 1 at the end sometimes. Right, but we can think of the program sort of already saving the whole space of numbers, and you're selecting one of those numbers from the whole possible set of numbers in that space. Okay, that's typically what we mean when we say that there's a float. Okay, so we have integers, which are the whole numbers. 1, for example, is an integer, and 1.01 is a float. These are the sort of dominant number types or value types that you're going to need to be familiar with and understand how they work in Python. So we're going to compare these integers, floats, and also think about how they compare to strings. Okay, so let's start out by adding integers. And then we're going to also add or concatenate strings. Okay. So if we add integers, say 5 plus 3, let's make that a value, num1. And then let's make that same value, but let's do that as a string, num1s equals 5 plus 3. Okay, we're going to get two different outcomes. So at the end here, we're going to print num1, and we're going to print num1s. Why don't we add a description to this? And we'll say adding integers, adding strings. Okay, and let's add a single quotes to this adding strings, just to kind of, or to the adding, I should say here, to adding and adding strings. I think that's interesting. Let's run it and see what happens. Okay, so when we add the integers, 5 plus 3, that's 8. But when we add those 5 plus 3 as strings, we concatenate the strings and we get 5, 3, or 53. This is a really important distinction to understand when you're working with Python. Be very careful if you're concatenating strings and you mean to be adding integers. And sometimes, for example, when you're working with columns of data, the names of the columns will be numbers, but they'll actually be strings or read as strings. So that's a nice case where you need to really be aware if you're trying to add the columns, say, or work with the columns, that you're working with strings, not working with numbers. Or let's work with floats. Okay, this is the other predominant value in any sort of programming language. And so we'll have num1. If you work in Excel also, you might be familiar with these. Num2. And we're going to see something interesting when we print num1, num2, and num3. Let's print it like it looks like in the book. And I'm going to use that SCP equals \n just to get some practice here. Okay. This is a case where it might be useful to copy and paste to make it easier. Right. So okay, that looks neat. Let's run it. And now we can see here num1, num2, num3. I'm not sure I prefer that. Let's get rid of these SCP. I don't think that looks as nice. Okay. And instead, let's just include a space. Okay. And that looks pretty good. Num1, num2, num3. And you can see these floats, even though they're integers divided by integers, they yield floats. Okay. So, and if I even checked, I could say type num1, and it's going to tell me it's a float. Okay. Let's see what else happens. What's one way to generate an error? We're going to look at that. And so we have num1, num2, num3, but let's add a variable, sumnums, okay? Which is just num1 plus num2 plus num3. Okay. And now let's print out the sum of the numbers, sumnums. Let's identify it as sumnums. Oh. And you can see here, oh, gotta type it again. Oh, interesting. Do it again. There we go. All right. And you can see here, 4.25 is the sum of these fractions. Okay, that's simple enough. But what if we tried to concatenate strings and sumnums? Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, what if I said print num1 plus num2 plus num3, and then I said plus sumnums. Okay, now this is some ways nonsense because I'm not really summing or concatenating anything here, but you can kind of see the pattern anyhow. And so I have a string that I'm trying to sum or concatenate with sumnums, and I'm going to get an error. It runs to this point in the program, says, hey, you can't do that. That's weird. Say, okay, well, that's fine. Now I could, instead, I could say, well, let's turn num1 into a string. Let's turn num2 into a string. Let's turn num3 into a string. And then let's add or concatenate sumnums. Okay. And I'm not going to turn sumnums into a string. Okay. I'm going to get the same error. Let's turn sumnums into a string. And you can see here that it's added all of these together now. Okay, and maybe I can get a better readout if I move this left. Nah, it just does the same. Okay. But you can see here, basically, it's sort of mashed all the numbers together. 4.25, 1.6667, dot, 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 right? Okay. So instead of summing all the numbers, we concatenated the strings. Right, we could do the same thing. We could print num1 plus num2 plus num3 plus sum nums, which is just going to give you sum nums times 2. And you can see here 8.5, right? It's just 4.25 times 2. That's pretty straightforward. And yeah, that looks right. Let's add the descriptor here to make this look a little bit nicer. Sum nums as strings. Okay. Now when we run it, that's going to make it a little bit nicer in the output here. Okay. But you can see the same sort of thing has gone on. So we sort of played around just to review. An integer plus an integer yields an integer. We can even say, let's add in the notes here, integer plus integer yields integer. Say string, I'm going to put in quotes, plus string yields concatenated. Or we can say concatenate strings. Be a nice way to say it. Float plus minus times divided by float yields a float. Finally down here, don't mix adding values and concatenating strings. Okay, so everything we learned in this lesson can be summed up in these lines. And I encourage you to look at the remainder of the chapter in terms of what's going on with what happens, different kinds of errors you can yield. But overall, these are the key takeaways. So if you went through all of this, you should be more than fine. And I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about Chapter 1 material. See you in Chapter 2.